ecologist by training, but I'm interested in all the interactions. Ecology is a science of interactions, and in my job at Longwood Gardens, I manage ecosystems, and I manage them for a variety of purposes, while also doing scientific research on how best to manage those ecosystems and how best to accomplish ecological restoration. So I'm going to talk about how all of that fits together in the context of bluebirds today. I can get my thing over on the right screen. There we go. So many of you may be familiar with the eastern bluebird. Beautiful, beautiful bird. This is the male with the lovely blue coloring on the back, and there's rusty red brown on the front, white underparts. I'm going to play the call of the bluebird for you now. This is a sound I get to hear in the Meadow Garden at Longwood during the season when the bluebirds are with us, which is pretty much all year. We're in their year-round range. So today I'm going to talk about North American bluebirds and their history, population decline and then recovery, their habitat needs, their competitors, their predators, all these things we have to think about, and the programs that we have at Longwood for banding them and encouraging their well-being, and some pointers for attracting bluebirds to your property if you're interested in doing that. So eastern bluebirds are one of 3 species of North American bluebirds. The other 2 are found much further west in general, so you're not likely to accidentally see one of these other bluebirds, though there are some other birds which are blue that you could mistake them for. Bluebirds have had a very interesting history in eastern North America. Oops, I've got some things on there that I don't know how they were still there, but anyway, working with slides. So if you turn the clock way back to about 1500, you can imagine that most of the eastern US was forested. This is an old growth hemlock forest, very, very big trees. The land management that was done by people who were living in eastern North America at the time was generally localized, and land management tended to happen in an area and then after a while move to a different area rather than being quite as permanent in its location as later European land uses. Meadows as a habitat type were mostly an ephemeral condition. They were something that passed over time because most meadows were caused by some kind of ecological disturbance. And I'll talk more about ecological disturbances in a minute, but things like a big fire might leave a scar, where there were no trees, and then you would have a meadow there. Meadows were also created by really harsh conditions, like in alpine zones where there's frozen conditions through much of the year. Places with weird soils like serpentine barrens, and very wet soils. So places where trees can't grow because trees win. This is the thing with trees. They're very tall and they can shade everything else out. So if there are trees there, and there are tree seeds all around in the east. So, if the tree can get there, it's probably going to win unless something is keeping it from growing there. So here's an example of an alpine meadow. I'm very fond of alpine meadows. I'm originally from the Rockies. With European colonization, the land was really cleared of forest in most of the east. And when I say cleared, I mean really cleared, not like we have now. We see trees regularly, but the land was really cleared. There are a number of interesting historical reasons for this. If you haven't read William Cronin's Changes in the Land, it's a fascinating history of land history in the eastern U.S. It's about New England, but it applies to a lot of other places as well. Improvement of the land was part of the definition of ownership, and that actually involved clearing the trees. That's one reason. Wood was also used as not only a building material, but also as a primary fuel. steamships were powered by wood, for example. And then logging of the land was then followed by grazing, which kept trees from regenerating. And this caused agricultural meadows, and not only people grew crops, but also their large areas became pasture land or hay fields. And this transformation of the landscape at a very large scale caused major shifts in the biodiversity. By the late 1600s, people were reporting that wild turkeys were becoming rare. So, the habitat for many of the species that had lived in the forests of Eastern North America had disappeared, but it created opportunities for other species, such as those that thrive in meadows. By 1800, most of the eastern US had been cleared of forests, and what you had instead were crops and hay fields and pastures, and you had some remnant woodlots. There's an interesting set of drawings from the maps from the Forest Service, just sort of looking at trends over time in terms of forested areas of the United States. And by 1926, there was not a lot of forest in the East left. But some other processes started to happen socially. So transportation to the west improved, and people who had been farming the rocky soils of the east, there are places with wonderful farmland in Maryland and Virginia, but in New England, they were farming with a lot of rocks, and people started moving west as transportation became available, as people were forcibly removed from their lands, creating opportunities for other people. The Erie Canal opened, making it possible to move agricultural products. Logging became unprofitable in forested areas. People weren't doing that for an economic activity. And then with the Great Depression, there was further abandonment of farmland, which led to a reforestation of the eastern United States. And it's really interesting, and if I'm guessing that many people who would attend a talk like this like to go walk around in the woods sometimes. And if you do that, many of you are probably aware of the signs of these former land uses. You can find the piled up stones that used to be along the edge of a farm field, and the remnants of building foundations. You can look for plow troughs. You can see all kinds of interesting stuff. There's a field guide to that that's really good. I can find the reference for you if people want to know about it later. But so a lot of those abandoned farms have now become forests again. And now urbanization is the primary driver of habitat transformation from spontaneous vegetation into other kinds of land use in the mid-Atlantic anyway. There's been some interesting work out of University of Maryland on that. How does this relate to bluebirds? We'll get to that. Bluebirds like open space, not so much forests. But this trend of increasing urban development is happening not just here, but all over the world. Humanity is now more than half urban in terms of where people live. And this is happening all over the place. I love this graph. It's like, I'm very curious to dig into where they got the 10,000 BCE, but the human population was a lot smaller at the time, but this is proportion of human population. So cities have been around for a while, but they weren't very big. And so not only is half of humanity living in cities, but in many, many countries, more than 75% of the population lives in cities and towns. In the US, the last figure was like 78%. And if we zoom in on our region, this is city lights at night from the US space station, or I'm sorry, from the International Space Station, but it was on the NASA website. So you can see that many different kinds of habitats are being transformed. Meadows, in some ways, are particularly vulnerable because they don't have trees on them and don't have to be cleared. And so remaining meadows in the form of hay fields, in the form of, and a lot of them are hay fields or abandoned fields, are frequently subject to development. So how do we make room for bluebirds in this context, right? So we've had this process where over history, there wasn't much space for bluebirds because things were mostly forest. And they were living somewhere else. There might have been fewer of them. And then we had this great expansion of wonderful habitat for bluebirds. And then that habitat has shrunk by both reforestation and then now habitat transformation in our region, mostly due to urbanization at this point. So how do we make room for them? Well, we need to think about what they need. And they need a lot of, they need space. They need meadow vegetation. And people all over the place have taken an interest in bluebirds in particular. Cavity nesters are an interesting bunch of birds to work with, but people are making space not only for bluebirds, but also for many other species and creating habitats for them. So what does a bluebird need? It doesn't necessarily need a fancy roof, although they're kind of cute. So they need open areas. They need places without trees. They need, it's interesting, the concept of open. What is open? It means short vegetation that people can look over, I guess. They need scattered trees because they do perch and hunt. Other kinds of perching spots, they'll perch on all kinds of things. They actually really like power lines. They are ground feeders. They need insects. And so they need plants that feed those insects. They need holes. They're secondary cavity nesters, so they don't make their own cavities. They need cavities, and there's an interesting history there where they were using wooden fence posts in the expansion of agriculture period, and then people stopped using wooden fence posts, and that was part of in the 30s. Their population started to really noticeably decline, and that was when people started to take note. Hence, bluebird boxes. So from my perspective as an ecologist land manager, the habitat seems like the first and primary thing that we need to offer them. And habitat for bluebirds means habitat for other meadow loving species as well. And so from my perspective, I'm thinking about the plants, because the plants are what provide the food and the shelter for everything else. So if you're going to try to tell the plants what to do, you have to understand how plant communities change over time. And change in plant communities in both what plants are there and what the structure of the plant life is, we can call that vegetation dynamics. And there are three basic ingredients for what causes plant communities to change over time. Remember, meadows are a plant community that naturally does change into forest in this region. So we have to manage that in order to keep a meadow for any period of time. So first thing is the availability of sites for the plants you want to grow in. So for example, meadow vegetation, if there's too much shade, meadow vegetation isn't going to grow. So you've got to keep trees from growing in some way to make the sites available for meadow vegetation. Whether a place is available for plants to grow in at this point in this region has to do with the way that the land is arranged, the heterogeneity of different land uses over space, the legacies of many land uses over time, and of course people's changing priorities and values, which influence very much what happens with land. The second thing the second ingredient for change over time in plant communities is the availability of species. So are they already there? Are they remnant from the original populations? And I've noticed that when I talk with students, sometimes they get really excited about the idea that, in any given place, there are probably some plants there that have been there since before people. They're just descendants of the plants that were there before. So there are plants that come as part of the legacies of land use in human activity over time. Can plants get there is one of the other questions. So plants can move. but they generally only do that in one stage of their life. Do they move very far? And that's as seeds. So, you know, can they get there? Can they blow there? Can they be brought there by birds? What is the surrounding matrix? So, you know, a place that's got one kind of plants or no plants, you know, you look at a place like an urban park and you have horticultural plants around it and maybe some weeds, but you don't have like forest plants in as large of abundance or in the same kind of species composition. People add plants by planting. I do this all the time. And then there are plenty of plants that have been introduced accidentally, like our beautiful yet problematic friend Oriental bittersweet shown in the picture. A plant I frequently remove. And then those things mix together in species performance, which is all about how the plants interact with each other. So I mentioned Oriental bittersweet. That's a plant that can really cover other plants and can suppress tree regeneration. So how the plants compete with each other, how the plants coexist with each other, how much space they take up, all of that is part of species performance. And all of that is affected by the ways that people have transformed the landscape. So, you know, creating smaller and smaller habitats, changing the climate, both locally by urban warming, and then in the larger picture, soils, disturbance. We're going to come back to that again. And then, you know, there are things like pollinators and seed dispersers. And, you know, in terms of birds like the bluebird, these birds are very effective dispersers of berries. So they help move their own food around. Some of those berries are nicer than others for other things in the environment. So returning to this idea of disturbance, because it is so important for the habitat that bluebirds need. A disturbance is any event that causes an abrupt change in an ecosystem. So it changes the availability of resources and it changes the physical environment. Now, Mount St. Helens blowing up, that was a really big disturbance. Most disturbances are not quite that extreme. There are many types of different disturbances, and they vary in scale. So you might have, you know, a small amount of flooding from a heavy storm, like we've been having lately, that then will go down, you know, in a few days or a week. Or you might have major flooding, or you might have Mount St. Helens blowing up. The frequency of disturbances is also important. And this is something that is important to meadow ecology. So fire is a part of the ecology of some meadow systems. It's also a part of some forest systems. Although what's going on right now is another thing entirely. Talk about incredible scale. But some disturbances happen with regularity and some happen infrequently. So a given place might, even in a fire adapted ecosystem, might not burn but once every 10 or 15 years. Whereas in a stream system, you would have flooding regularly, with seasonal patterns in precipitation. The intensity, again, talking about fire, this is like something I usually talk about, but I feel like right now it's a heavy topic. So the intensity of fire can really vary. So it can be a cool ground fire that just burns the low-lying plants and stops that year's seedlings from regenerating, or it can be something that is much more massive and covers a larger area. Ecologically speaking, one of the interesting things about fire is that it's never uniform in its intensity, leaving some seed sources for future regeneration. Urbanization is a really intense disturbance. It's one of the more long-lasting ones as well. So, thinking about transformation at the landscape scale, that's a very strong and long-lasting disturbance. So, when we think about I work a lot with ecological restoration, trying to improve the condition of ecosystems that have been damaged in some way. And something that that I have been very happy to see enter the discourse about ecological restoration over the years, and this has been largely driven by people in Europe who have cultural landscapes that go back millennia, that that we can include cultural landscapes and ecosystems as a type of ecosystem that we might want to restore. So, for example, creating meadows of a, that's a mosquito. Sorry, creating meadows that are similar to what you might have found in an agricultural system hundreds of years ago, because that habitat is now rare and because native species depend on it. So a meadow is something that happens after a disturbance, right? So, and often that disturbance is fire or mowing or grazing. So at Longwood, we get to do both mowing and fire, which not everybody gets to do to manage their meadows. Definitely ask your neighbors and check your check your local rules before burning any meadows in your yard or in your community, because sometimes people don't like that. So people have observed that there is this typical succession of vegetation that happens over time after a disturbance, and what happens in that succession is particular to the biome that you're in, the type of habitat that you're in, and what the disturbance regime is. People had noticed this a long time ago, and as people have studied that in greater detail, they've realized that actually different species come in at different points in this process and change it over time. And so when we're thinking about managing for a species like the bluebird that needs a particular sort of moment in time of this process, we also have to manage what species are present to offer the things that the bluebird needs. So here's an example from an experimental forest in New Jersey, the Hutchison Memorial Forest, which is managed by Rutgers University. They have been doing this experiment to look at this kind of change over time and to understand it better, where they started with a farm that was, they were given a farm and some old growth forest that was next to it, part of the same property, and they've been letting it go over time. How strange, there's an animation in here that is very odd and not everything is appearing there. Looks like all the labels are there now, right? So they've been letting it go and then looking at in chunks, and then looking at these different aged pieces of field. And so if you have a farm field, and this is the process that much of the East has undergone, you have a farm field and you let it go, there are some trends in what tends to happen. So, in the beginning you have annuals. After a while you start having dominance by perennials. Goldenrod is a really classic example of that. After about 10 years, you start having early pioneer trees starting to become dominant. That's a little Juniperus virginiana there, eastern red cedar. After 20 years, those trees start to close in, and after 40 years, and that's how long the experiment's been going on, you start getting closed canopy forest. So it didn't actually take that long after with these socioeconomic changes for the landscape to grow trees again. So if we want to keep it in a condition that's good for bluebirds, basically we have to be disturbing that land at less than every 5 years. It's my face. And all the while, we're having species are jumping around the landscape, entering our meadow. And at Longwood, we definitely have forests right next to the meadow. So there are plenty of trees that are ready to make their way in there. So if we think about, what does a bluebird like? They like these. These are all good things for bluebirds. Small fruits that they don't have to chew. So a successful bluebird nest is going to have 3 to 6 eggs. These are some pictures that were taken very recently during the coronavirus shutdown. Longwood was closed for the first time ever, and we couldn't even have our wonderful volunteers who normally run the Bluebird program and actually make the observations in the nest boxes. So we suddenly had to have staff take over the whole program and check all 197 boxes on a weekly basis. This happened right at the beginning of the nesting season. So we quickly threw together some training materials, and many of these images are from staff that took pictures. So a successful bluebird nest has 3 to 6 eggs. Here's the female, more lightly colored, but I really think the plumage is quite beautiful. The eggs are generally blue. About 10% of the time you'll see white ones. This is what they look like when they first hatch. They get fluffy and then they grow their feathers like birds do. There are a number of other cavity nesters that we find using our nest boxes. Tree swallows, which have these, they use feathers in their nest, so they're pretty distinctive. We also get chickadees. Their eggs are very small and speckled. And we also see some time sharing among the birds. Here we have a bluebird nest on top of a chickadee nest. The chickadees generally use moss in their nests, so they're pretty distinctive. House wrens use lots of twigs. And you also see, this one here is built on top of a chickadee nest. Generally, the volunteers get in there and check and clean out the nests after an observed nesting attempt is finished, because that keeps the birds healthier. And we get house sparrows, which make a rather messier nest. We also get predators, so this is something to think about if you're thinking about establishing bluebird boxes. Raccoons, snakes, everything thinks that everything likes eggs. I mean, and small birds. So we have predator guards. We use a stovepipe baffle type predator guard on our nest boxes. And the program has been going since 1972. There was a group of staff that were interested in bluebirds, and gradually the volunteer team also took shape and has been going on for a very long time. Warren Lauder, who started the program, was an innovator and worked out a very good design to improve survival rates of chicks. And basically the innovations of this box design are that it allows more airflow. So it has a little bit of ventilation in the bottom as well as the sides, so that it's not too much ventilation, so they don't get too cold, but also during the hot days of summer, they don't cook. So through 2000, we were up to 100 nest boxes, and now I think we're actually at 197 now, although boxes come and go. We also have, some of these are in farm fields, and we have a farmer, and sometimes he, removes one with a tractor, but we put them back. So there was an experiment with a green roof design as well, and that was we were looking into whether that had effects on cooling. Short version, a white roof shingle is about as good for cooling, but these look really great, and people really enjoy having them near their house. So people are always asking for this design. We have a number of different bluebird trails that are assigned to different people that go and check them on a weekly basis. The largest of those is their BB, the original one in the middle. That's the Meadow Garden, where there are 40 something. Oh wait, it probably says on here 41.
So we have actually a couple of quick questions, if you could answer them real quick. So the first is just based off of if a bluebird were to take over a nest that was being used by another bird, would they do so before that first bird's eggs are finished, or would they like kick those out, or would they just take it over once they're done?
In general, I think that they're building on an empty nest. The kicking out is more of a problem with the house sparrows actually kicking other birds out, including bluebirds.
Great. And then another one is actually about the nest box designs, and they're wondering if you can find them somewhere or just buy them online easily enough.
I don't know if you can buy them online, but I can certainly give a link to the design. It's online. It's available for free.
Awesome. That'd be wonderful. That is all the questions for now.
Okay. Great. So we also have a banding program, and that's Ian from the Delaware Naturalist Society, and he is a licensed and very much approved bird bander. He's a very careful guy who does great work. He's an ornithologist, and there has been a banding program going on for I think at least 10 years. This year, sadly, we had to put it on hold because that was happening right in the middle of the shutdown. But we'll be back next year. We also made a big transition during the coronavirus shutdown this year. We had been talking about bringing the Bluebird team into the digital age. Like a lot of long-term environmental monitoring projects, everything was happening on paper, and then some wonderful volunteer had the job of trying to transcribe everybody's handwriting and trying to make sense of scratches and missing stuff, and where did that piece of paper go, and chasing everybody down to get everything. And so this year, we actually did this during the staff transition because we were going to have to train the staff anyway, so we figured we might as well make all the training materials and just train them and then train all the volunteers afterwards. But we transitioned to Cornell's Project Nest Watch, which actually turns out to be a real easy way to collect the data and to get a lot of really good information. And what's wonderful about this is that the data are collected in real time. There are some people who really still don't want to use their phone, so they'll do it on paper, but then they can go home and then enter it on a computer. Or give it to the one person who's still doing that for other folks, which is fine. There's a mix of people's different love or non-love for technology, and that's just fine. But what happens is that we have these totals right now of what the program is looking like this year. And one of the folks on my staff is just great with developing stuff like this. She drew these pictures and made this slide. And the basic protocol for NestWatch is pretty simple. We like to use a smartphone to take photos rather than trying to get our eyeballs in the nest. Quickly sticking a phone in there and taking a picture rather than putting our head near the nest. And then uploading those observations. So here's some pictures from this season. Here's some typical bluebird nests. In our meadow, they generally are using grasses, although they also sometimes use pine needles. In some places, if there are more pine needles, it'll be pretty much made of pine needles. Those other nests that we talked about. This is a type of nest we found a lot of as well. Ooh, stinky, so stinky. And this is something where, if you have nest boxes, it's a really good idea because, if they're in a meadow, it's pretty likely that there might be some blackberries or some roses or some other sort of cane-shaped vegetation growing in the area. It's a really good idea to keep that stuff away from the nest boxes because that's how these guys get up there. They got around the predator guard by climbing up the blackberry stems. I think I actually had all these photos already. So if you want to attract bluebirds, what might you want to do? So there's lots of off-season activity to get prepared for attracting bluebirds. So if you want to set up nest boxes, you want to get that together over the winter. The nice winter indoor construction project. Locate your birdhouse or make it yourself. There are other things you can do during the season, especially early in the season, when in the springtime, when if there are, like this season, we had a kind of cold, wet spring at Longwood, and so we didn't supplement. We don't supplement the larger project, but people who are members of the team supplemented with mealworms at their houses, because if the insects are not warm enough to be flying around, then the birds are not going to have very much food. Monitoring the activity during the breeding season, removing nests when the nesting attempt is finished, when all of the young have fledged, can help that nest to be used quickly again. And it also helps to keep down the load of parasites in the nest. There are a number of insects that like to bother the bluebirds. Installing predator guards is a good idea. So if you're thinking about setting up bluebird nest boxes, consider what predator guard you want to use. And a great way to do this is to organize a bluebird trail where you can check multiple boxes along the way. Whether a given one is occupied at any given time is up to the bluebirds.
So we actually have another really quick question too.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. So the question is, do the bluebirds mind when you are checking on their nests? Do they seem stressed?
So if the female doesn't want to leave the nest, you just quickly shut it. They will usually sort of watch you from a distance. You knock. I didn't give you guys like the whole rundown of how exactly you approach the nest box, but these open with a screwdriver. So I take the screwdriver and knock politely on the side to flush the birds. If they're in there, they'll go sit on a shrub and then they'll come back immediately when you leave. The idea with these nest visits, it's less than 1 minute. You want to make it as rapid as possible. But if the bird doesn't want to leave, you just leave. You don't take pictures.
That makes sense. And we have one more actually. It was just a clarification on why you removed the nest after each season. The person asking the question said that you mentioned parasites. Is that the only reason?
They also tend to occupy the boxes again more quickly. That for either the same pair or a different pair might find that box to be suitable more quickly, just making more box space available by removing the nests.
All right, perfect. That is it for now.
All right. So there are lots of things you can do plant-wise to attract bluebirds. Many of these things you'll notice are berry bearing. So they really like small berries. So I love all of these plants. They're all nice things that you could have in your yard. These are also good for many other species. So, I can't say that only the bluebirds will come visit them. They might feed bluebirds. They're also going to feed lots of other things. And that's what I've got for you today. But I'd be happy to take any other questions.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. So I would like at this point to invite the audience to unmute themselves and ask their questions to you using their voice, or if you would like, continue using the chat for questions and comments. Thank you.
I'd be curious whether any of you have experience with bluebird boxes.
I have experience with bluebirds that nest in the holes in the side of my house that are made by the pileated woodpeckers.
Oh, that's a secondary cavity.
It's actually, it's kind of nice. I mean, it's so funny. I get there's like two of them that the woodpeckers can. I live on the Blue Ridge in West Virginia, and we're actually forested, but there's enough open up areas that they're here all the time. I buy mealworms by the 10-pound sack. And it's real funny because actually I was going to ask you, there's really no way that I can get into the holes that are in the side of the house to clean out the nests. So is that a problem? or should we?
I guess you could ask the Bluebirds.
It's like, yeah, right. Or do I pretend like this is a tree cavity and I can't do anything about it anyway? Which is what I've done. This has been like the second time that I've had a pair, and they usually do two broods, and I think it's the same pair. Anyway, it's interesting.
But you bring up two interesting things there. One is that reminds me that if you would like to have bluebirds at a feeder, you generally need to provide them with mealworms. That is what attracts them.
You get these nice little mealworm feeders. The only problem is I also have, living in the woods, I have so many birds, and so I have literally a murder of crows. And the murder of crows, my constant murder of crows has managed to destroy 2 mealworm feeders in about 3 months. But anyway, but yeah, mealworms are, and everybody likes mealworms too. It's really a nice thing for all the other guys too, that especially when insects aren't appearing when they're supposed to be there. You know, robins will eat mealworms.
So we actually have a number of questions in the chat. I would like to read real quick. So the first is, do you ever put in paired boxes as to avoid any competition between birds that would use them?
We have actually done that in places where we've noticed that the bluebirds are not there, but some other species is. Regularly, we have put in paired boxes. Yeah.
All right. And then since we were just talking about mealworms, this next question is about mealworms. Person asking has said that you always hear about live mealworms as opposed to dry ones. Do you do anything besides natural berries to attract them to any of your sites?
Well, we don't, I mean, it's at Longwood, we're not feeding them mealworms. It's more like members of the volunteer teams who have boxes near their house. We basically provide the habitat. So we're providing the insect buffet, you know, by providing a diverse plant community that provides the things that they want to eat.
All right.
I don't know anything about live mealworms, but I know they like lots of other live insects.
Good to know. And do you have any specific numbers on the bluebird population decline and recovery by any chance?
I don't have that off the top of my head. I'm not sure that those numbers are readily accessible either, because a lot of that happened in a time when probably the data wasn't real good at a large scale.
All right. And then the next question is very similar about how do we know about these bird populations in the East over time?
Well, what we do know is we know about the habitat, and that generally what populations expand and contract as the habitat becomes more or less available to them.
Right. And then we have lots of coming in, so I'm just gonna keep on going.
Great.
The next one is about the fledglings and the relation to the nest as to where they go after they are fledged. Do they usually travel far? Do they go anywhere?
So the banding program is not super old, and recapture rates are generally pretty low. I think that like in general for banding. So I think we had something like a 6% recapture, which is not bad. And I'm not sure exactly how far they have gone.
Okay. And then like
but we have seen them setting up shop. We have seen them nesting in other regional areas that have bluebird trails. They've found Longwood bluebirds like at Mount Cuba and at Winterthur. Wow,
very interesting. That was kind of leading to the next question, where the parents go once they're done with the brood. They usually stick around, have a nest in the same spot, or go elsewhere too.
Sorry?
About the adults, once they're done raising their young, their fledglings, do they usually travel far away as well?
In the region where Longwood is, they are year-round resident.
Okay. And then just with all this bird talk of Longwood, are there any other bird observation programs that occur there?
Well, we have purple martins, and we're in the process of joining an interesting telemetry study looking at short-range movement and behavior with purple martins. We're collaborating with oh goodness, trying to remember the full name of the organization. Anyway, but we're collaborating to look at kestrels as well, and we have a couple of we have a few now kestrel boxes.
That is really cool. I love martins. That's my thing.
We have boxes for a number of other things, but they're not. We have wood duck boxes that we monitor as well.
Okay. And then I'm just gonna keep going. We still have a couple more. This one's about really the amount of space. Like, is there a yard size requirement that you need, and is it always necessary to use two birdhouses close together?
In terms of, I don't know what the minimum requirements would be to attract bluebirds. I think it's more thinking about what the landscape context is around you and whether or not it would provide enough insect life for them to live on. You know, if you're in an area where there isn't really any meadow type vegetation, even if you have a big yard, if it's like a mowed lawn or in some other kind of, you know, if it's forested or something, you might or might not be able to attract bluebirds. I would, if you're interested in putting them putting a bluebird box in a smaller area, you might check and see whether bluebirds have been observed locally close to your home to see if it's likely that you might be able to attract them.
Cool. The next one is, what are the key predators for bluebirds? I know we have the pictures of the snake and the raccoon.
Those are two.
Yeah.
The mice will eat them. Pretty much anything that can get inside there and snack on them will. And I think the nest predators are the ones that we really are focused on.
Mm-hmm. So next is more about Longwood in general and how the gardens got involved in ecological restoration.
What's that? I was curious if anything you can get all. I don't think so.
We can hear you. How the gardens got involved in ecological restoration. It's been my understanding now. I have been at Longwood for a little over a year now, and my position as associate director for land stewardship and ecology is a new position. But the previous person who was who was managing the natural lands that surround the formal gardens was doing ecological restoration as well. I bring a different kind of focus to that, and I'm working on developing a science-based management program. So I think there's been, my understanding is, you know, again, from what people tell me, is that there's been a movement toward more and more including the ecology of the surrounding landscape. And there's a rich history of the land and how it's been managed over time.
Well, it's exciting to hear about the new position that it didn't realize was created. So we have two more. The first one is actually from Sarnella asking, I know we had the slide about the plants with berries to incorporate into your yards. Are there any additional species that you should think about, especially ones that probably are more meadow perennials?
I think in terms of plants that they eat, the berries are really the thing in terms of eating. But the rest of the meadow is providing all of the other life, right? Like it's providing all of the diverse insect life that is nourishing them. So I would say go for diversity, go for a meadow mix.
That's perfect. We'll make sure to share the list of plants that you had on that slide with everyone as well.
Yeah, and if there are any other resources that I mentioned that people are interested in, I'm happy to give those as well.
So next question is kind of similar to how we were talking about the process for opening a nest and checking on it. This one is more related to just taking videos of a bird, like how, if you were to observe a bird, is there like a general amount of distance you should stay from them as to not stress them out? This one's asking from an urban area in DC.
I'm not sure. Other people might be able to better answer that than I am. We did try bird cam inside the nest boxes at one point.
That was actually the next question. If you had any bird cams that you, for the project, that you were gonna possibly stream on the internet.
I think that's a fun idea. I don't think we'll be putting them on all 197, but
wouldn't imagine. But you did mention that you tried putting one in a nest?
Yeah, I've been told that it has been tried, but I haven't actually seen the footage myself.
All right. And there's no other bird cams that exist at Longwood?
No. Not a bad idea, though.
Yeah.
If we have any interesting nesting going on.
Yeah, that'd be fun. And with that, I think that is all the questions from the chat as of this moment.
All right. So thanks, everyone. This has been a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Leah. We learned so much with you today. So please join us again here on Thursday for the Cicada Safari. And for now, have a great night and join me congratulating Leah and thanking her for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.